Okay, to make sure that everyone's like got time to answer this question, we're going to start with this top hat question. So I'm going to go ahead and open it, and you guys can like answer it as you hop in. This is just asking about the equilibrium condition from the previous lectures. All right, let's see how you guys did. So this happened in the last class as well. I think what you guys might be remembering is here, this B answer that was the most popular one is actually just how we describe aggregate expenditures. It's just the definition. It's not the equilibrium condition. So the equilibrium condition, if you remember, this is a Keynesian idea. This idea that the amount of things that we produce in the economy, which is GDP, is equal to the amount of expenditure in the economy, which is this aggregate expenditure. So this A is actually the equilibrium condition, and B is just the definition of aggregate expenditures, just how we describe aggregate expenditures. But that's okay, it was just a review. So no worries about that. I'm gonna go ahead and get into the slides. This is where I had trouble last time. So hopefully this is not a huge deal and I can fix it. Fingers crossed. There's a lot more of you in this lecture than there was last time. So. All right, hopefully everyone can see this. It looks like my screen is sharing just fine. So we'll go ahead and get into the lecture. Like I said, we're gonna finish up the aggregate expenditures module, and we're gonna start the aggregate demand and aggregate supply module. So this was that top hat question that I just described to you guys. Which of the following is an equilibrium condition? You can see in that box on the bottom right, kind of describing what that equilibrium condition is, just saying that everything produced is purchased by someone in the economy. That's equilibrium under the aggregate expenditures model. Today, we're going to do some math, some manipulation. I know that maybe doesn't sound fun, but hopefully it'll teach us a little bit about how the aggregate expenditures model works. I actually have no idea what the Monday song is, so no, I'm unfortunately not going to do it. But I wish Jeff had told me. People are saying it's page like 157 in the workbook, if you're wondering. And this might be, I think this is actually the beginning of the workbook pages. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to talk about these three equations described here. We're going to manipulate them a little bit until we end up with just one single equilibrium condition. So we've got that equation one, the equilibrium condition we talked about earlier, just says everything that's produced is purchased. We've got the definition of aggregate expenditures, and then how we like to describe consumption is equation number three. We do it in terms of A, which is autonomous consumption. You see, you've kind of got a guide on the right side there. And disposable income, that's just how much you receive maybe from your job minus the taxes, multiplied by your marginal propensity to consume, which you guys should remember from your previous lecture. All right, if you didn't get a chance to write these down, I don't really know if you have to because I don't remember the workbook pages, but if you didn't get a chance to write these down, it's okay. We're gonna see them again right here. So no worries. The first thing we're gonna do, like I said, all we're gonna do is kind of manipulate these questions around to solve for like one single equilibrium condition. Don't worry if you don't have every single detail of this math. It's not something that you're going to be asked to like replicate on the exam. The goal of describing this to you guys is hopefully just so we get an understanding of how changes in one of these variables affects real GDP. So at the end of this, I'm going to be able to say, if I change investment by this much, then how much am I going to change real GDP? And from just these equations, it doesn't look like maybe that's super obvious, but we hopefully will be able to get there by the end of this lecture. So stay tuned. The first thing that we're going to do is make a substitution. So we're going to pull the right side of equation 3, which is describing consumption, and we're just going to put it in for consumption in equation 2. And you can see that's what we've done here. We've just inserted our consumption in terms of autonomous consumption and disposable income into this aggregate expenditures description. The next thing again, if you didn't get to write these down, that's okay, they're right here. The next thing that we're going to do is make this substitution. So keep in mind, just as a note, this is what that kind of bullet point is describing. Equation 1 is an equilibrium condition. That means that it doesn't always have to be true. It's just describing what our market looks like in equilibrium. But equation 4 is true by definition because that's how we defined aggregate expenditure and that's how we defined consumption. So equation 4 is always true, but equation 1 doesn't necessarily have to be true. We'll get into what happens when you don't have the same expenditure as you do when you have like some sort of gaps between, right? We normally discuss markets in equilibrium, so don't worry about that. But it's a condition, right? It's not a definition. So we're going to make the substitution right here. We're just going to put, basically, it's just going to be equation 4, but we're going to stick a y on the left side. And then that's going to be equation 5. You can see that's all we've done. It's just this equation 4, but we've stuck a y here. Now we're going to get into some more detailed manipulation of these variables. What my goal is here is I'm going to try to get y by itself, right? This might be a brief review of the last algebra class that you took. Hopefully that's not too sad or upsetting for some of you guys. What we're going to do first is we're going to distribute this marginal propensity to consume into this y, this real GDP, and this t. Keep in mind, one thing that I think was confusing in an earlier section is that this y right here is supposed to represent income, but this y here represents real GDP, and we're saying they're the same thing. And that's actually kind of an assumption in the aggregate expenditures model, right? That income, remember, in equilibrium, if everything that gets produced is spent, then your real GDP and overall income is going to be the same. So keep that in mind. We're going to use income and GDP kind of interchangeably. Once we get past this example, it's always going to be real GDP. But these y's in this model are the same, even though one's income and one is real GDP. That's an assumption of aggregate expenditures. So we're going to distribute this MPC. A is autonomous consumption. And so autonomous consumption is just how much you're going to spend regardless of your income. So, you know, I feel like as college students, some of us understand this, right? We might have a zero income or even a negative income, right? If we're going into some sort of debt, but we're still going to spend a certain basic amount of money to live, right? And it's basically the y-intercept of that consumption graph that you saw maybe 2 lectures ago. It might have been Friday. But yeah, so A is autonomous consumption, how much you spend regardless of your income. So we're going to distribute that MPC. We are going to subtract this new MPC times y term from both sides. And that means that we've got all of our y's here on the left side. Again, remember, I'm solving for y. So after, and I haven't done really anything over here to the right side, except I still got this MPC times t term that came from that distribution. All of these things I've left alone. This a, this I, this g, this nx, nothing's happened to it. Now I'm going to factor back out the y. And so I'm going to end up with y times 1 minus MPC. And I didn't do anything to the right side at all. And finally, my last step is I'm going to divide by this 1 minus MPC. Remember, I want to get y by itself. So I have y times something equals something else. All I have to do is divide both sides by this term, this 1 minus MPC. And this down here, this bottom equation, that is the equilibrium condition. We're going to put it in a different form so that it makes more sense. But this is the equilibrium condition. It doesn't seem very obvious right now what this means. But when I put it like this, so all I've done is move some stuff around. Like I said, this is the equilibrium condition. All I do is move some stuff around, and now it looks like this. And what we're seeing here is that y in equilibrium, which is real GDP in equilibrium, is 1 over 1 minus MPC times A, I, G, and NX. And this, if you remember from a previous lecture, this is the expenditures multiplier. If you remember, this is that kind of hand-to-hand exchange of dollars effect of a new expenditure, right? If you spend money on something, that money gets spent on something else, then that next party spends the money according to their marginal propensity to consume. And so this is like how much extra product you're generating in the economy from $1 spent. And that's going to apply to autonomous spending, to investment, to government spending, or to net exports. So basically, everything except taxes. Taxes get a special multiplier, the tax multiplier here. And if you don't remember why, you might need to review those slides as well. I think this was a previous lecture. So all these things are just related to the marginal propensity to consume. And then we're going to be able to describe changes in this real GDP, this real income, I guess, if we're saying they're the same thing, in equilibrium, based on how our variables in this first equation change. So the reason why some of you guys might notice that there's no change in A, change in autonomous spending. Yeah, there is going to be a recording of this lecture, by the way. There's no change in A, change in autonomous spending, that appears in the second equation. And the reason for that is because it's an assumption for us that autonomous spending doesn't change over time. Autonomous spending is just how much you need to live, so it's not going to appear in that second equation. And what we're saying, this is really the meat of all that math that we just did. We were trying to get here. We were trying to get that changes in real GDP can be described by these multipliers, these expenditure and tax multipliers, and then the changes in investment, government spending, net exports, and taxes. Yeah, somebody asked for an example of autonomous spending. So that's like if, regardless of how your income changes, so no matter how much money anybody has, right? Even if somebody is making no money, there are still certain things that you're going to buy. We probably observe this in an economy, right? We get, sometimes the calculation of these is a little complicated, and we're not going to get into it in this class, or the estimations of them, but people have to spend a certain amount of money to live, basically. So this autonomous spending is going to be how much you're going to consume, regardless of your income. All right, I'm going to pause for a second because this is kind of a big point. So if anybody wants to ask a question, you can unmute yourself or ask in the chat, and I'll try to get to it. Try not to go too fast, but Jeff told me I can maybe rush through the math a little bit, since it's not as, it's not going to appear on the test like some of these other concepts are. Yeah, delta Y sub E, that's change in real income, or real GDP is probably how we're going to refer to it. 1 year to the next is probably true. So technically the time isn't necessarily defined. Normally we go GDP year to year. You could just as easily do GDP quarter to quarter or month to month if you want to. Normally you're going to see it between years, right? GDP in 2010 versus 2009 or something like that. All right, I'm going to move on, but I'll save some time for questions after class if you guys still want to talk about some of this stuff. Now, once we have all this math down, we have this new equilibrium condition, and we can understand how the aggregate expenditures model works. Now we can talk about some dynamics. Dynamics just means if you change something, how does something else change? If we change investment, if we change government spending, how does that change real GDP? And this is the important part of doing all that math. So we've got a graph, as usual, right, for all this econ stuff. Graphs help us kind of describe what happens in the economy. And I think you guys should have used one of these graphs in a previous lecture to describe what equilibrium looks like. All we're going to do is we're going to take one of these aggregate expenditures lines, and we know that our equilibrium point in the economy is going to be where it touches this 45-degree line. So this 45-degree line is that aggregate expenditures equilibrium condition where AE equals Y, real GDP equals the amount of expenditures in the economy. Everything that's produced gets purchased. And so this point of intersection right here occurs at $400 billion in real GDP, and that's going to be our equilibrium point for the economy. Now we're going to move some stuff around. What if instead we increase investment to 65, right? So instead of an investment level of 15, we've got an investment of 65. So that means that this delta I is 50. And how is that going to change real GDP? I shift this line up 50 units. My new point of intersection is right here, and I'm going to run it down to the x-axis and see that there's our new equilibrium point is $500 billion real GDP. So I see a lot of stuff in the chat about being confused how the workbook is going to look. I can tell you that this is, Jeff mentioned to me, this might be a confusing section for the workbook because there's some gaps between what's kind of noted in the workbook. A lot of the workbook gaps, or sorry, a lot of the workbook notes are going to be from this math, right? You should be filling in stuff about these equations. And there's not so much about these dynamics. And the reason for that is because if you describe to me kind of I don't have the workbook, so if you want to know what's on the bottom of page whatever, you need to describe the question to me, and I can tell you if we're going to get there or not. But there are some gaps kind of between what we talk about and what comes in the workbook. So yeah, so we haven't done any of the market demand or aggregate demand, aggregate supply stuff. You want it to say 20A aggregate expenditures. And that's what we're going to work on right now. And I think we might have already gotten through it because there's a section of this PowerPoint that isn't in the workbook. And that's okay. You're still responsible for understanding the concepts here. It's just that Dr. Ackerman didn't make any notes in the workbook. So fill in the workbook what you can. If you have additional questions, we can talk about that after class, and I'll pull up the workbook. We can discuss that. So like I said, what if we change investment by 50? We're going to end up changing real GDP by 100. So again, in this example, we're assuming nothing else changes in the whole economy except investment. What happens to real GDP? And here's our next topic question. We're actually not going to do it because we're going to go through it, but I'm not going to open Top Hat because I don't want to mess up my internet connection again. So basically, in this example that we were just talking about, here's the picture for you. What is the expenditures multiplier? The answer to this is 2. And the reason is I'm actually going to scroll back to this equation. So like I said, in this example, the delta YE is 100, the delta I is 50, and everything else, all the other delta terms are 0. So this is 0, 0, 0. This completely drops out. Anytime you multiply something by 0, it's 0. And basically what I have is 100 equals expenditures multiplier times 50. So 50 times what is 100? 2. So that's how we got there. So like I said, no top hat on this one. Don't worry about it. This is the portion of the aggregate expenditure section that didn't end up in the workbook. And that's how aggregate expenditures relate to the business cycle. So one of the kind of like the key concepts in macroeconomics is to understand the business cycle. That's basically all the ups and downs of GDP over time. And we know that while our real GDP is generally increasing, right, our economy is generally growing over, say, the past 20, the past 30 years, we get a lot of these kind of like peaks and troughs. We end up in periods of expansion and periods of recession. Sometimes they're brief, sometimes they're longer, and sometimes they're depressions, sometimes they're minor recessions. And we want to understand how those come about, what's helping them last very long, what's preventing them, how big they're going to be. We want to understand a lot of stuff about the business cycle. And the aggregate expenditures model can help us a little bit. It can at least help us describe what might be happening according to Keynes. The idea is that we have some sort of expenditure in the economy that represents full employment. And this term full employment just means that our economy is operating at the capacity that it should. It means that we're at what's called the natural rate of unemployment. So there's no cyclical unemployment, which is that recessionary unemployment. It means that there just aren't enough jobs for people anymore. And so the unemployment rate, usually natural unemployment is kind of around 4%-ish. We say that that's a normal rate of unemployment. It just represents, right? Sometimes people have spent time between jobs, they're searching for a better one. Maybe you just get out of school, you have a great degree, it takes you, 3 or 4 months to find a job, so you spend time unemployed. And all of that is kind of fine. It's normal for an economy to have that. And so we define this to be full employment GDP, and let's say for this example, we're going to carry this through that's $500 billion. So our full employment GDP is $500 billion. Well, what if instead we observe that our actual real GDP, the actual expenditures in the economy, is $400 billion? So we have maybe a change in consumption, maybe our exports aren't as competitive. The government decides that they're going to cut a lot of their spending really rapidly. And so we're in a recession. right? Our economy is operating below full employment level, so we're in one of these troughs here. This is what's happening in that picture, is we're kind of decreasing in real GDP over time. And you're going to be able to describe this using what's called a recessionary gap. Basically, this is how bad is the economy? Yeah, let me go back here for a second. I think maybe this is what people might be missing. Like I said, there aren't any, I think this whole section, there aren't any notes on it. So if you're trying to take notes, it might take you a little bit. You might have to draw every graph. You might have to write this stuff. And you can always, I can spend a little bit of time going back to slides, but you can always go back to the notes that get posted on D2L if you need to fill in some gaps. I'll leave this up for a second. You guys can ask some questions if you want before I get into the recessionary and inflationary gaps. I'm going to text Jeff that the internet is working fine. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and describe this recessionary gap. It's really just the monetary amount that you're kind of missing that point of full employment. So if full employment in our economy, this is a different example from the one in the picture, but if our full employment level of expenditures or real GDP is $10 billion, and currently the expenditures are only $8 billion, this means that recessionary gap, how big our recession is $2 billion, right? It's just 10 billion minus 8 billion, that's it. We can do the same thing for inflation. So we could have an inflationary gap as well. So this is back to that first example. Our equilibrium real GDP is 500 billion, but we push our economy past this point. We're going to operate at above our real GDP at full employment. And we're going to be here at this A3 line, $540 billion. This means that unemployment is actually below the natural rate. So maybe we're experiencing like an extremely low unemployment rate, say like 1.5%. And what happens when we do that in our economy is actually kind of interesting, and I'll talk about it in just a second. I'm sorry if this is kind of losing some of you guys because there aren't any guided notes, but hopefully there will be an opportunity for you guys to look at these a little more closely once the PowerPoints get posted and write some of this stuff down. What I'm describing now is how this expenditures model relates to our business cycle, right? So we're looking for how aggregate expenditures create this. Back to the inflationary gap, we've got this going on in our economy. We're operating at below the natural rate of unemployment. And so what's going to happen is we're going to get an inflationary gap. And this means exactly what the recessionary gap does, except we're going to talk about having an expenditures over the full employment level. Yes, this stuff can still show up on the exam, even though it's not in the notes. So you still do need to know this. So basically in this new example, at full employment, we've got a total expenditure of $10 billion. Currently, the expenditures are $13 billion. This means that we have an inflationary gap here, right? Because our current expenditures are over our expenditures at full employment. So we've got a $3 billion inflationary gap. If you're thinking, oh, what could the exam question about this look like? It might look similar to this, right? So maybe it'll have this example without this last sentence, and it'll ask you what's going on. It might say, oh, there's a recessionary gap of 3 billion. There's this economy is in full employment. There's an inflationary gap. You'd have to pick out if it's a recessionary or an inflationary gap and the size of it, right? So like that's the kind of ideas you'd be working with probably on a multiple choice exam. And this is what would be happening in the economy, right? We get this expansion in the business cycle when we experience that inflationary gap. An inflationary and recessionary gap are the difference between being here in the business cycle and being over here in the business cycle. It's the difference between outperforming full employment GDP or underperforming full employment GDP, right? During a recession, we're operating below. Go back to this for just a second. And during an expansion, we're operating beyond what our full employment GDP or expenditure is. All right, I am going to move on. We have one more thing to talk about, and then I still have to get to the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So I'm sorry if you don't have time to write everything down. These slides will be posted. So you might be tempted to look at these expansions and to think, oh, it's great. Our economy should just grow and grow and grow. We constantly want to be in an expansion. Why is it bad for GDP to be really high? And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is just about that unemployment. If we have unemployment that's below the natural rate, so we've got these normal forms of unemployment, frictional and structural unemployment, are too low, right? If you remember, frictional unemployment is kind of this, I'm searching for a job, maybe I don't quite get one until a couple months after graduation, maybe I'm between jobs. And structural unemployment is about changing the nature of production in our economy. So no, this is still not in the notes. Changing the structural unemployment is about changing the things that we produce. So maybe things go out of production because we go beyond that technology, right? You think people whose certain skills are making something that's maybe out of date. Whoever's job it was to make those like Nokia phones that could survive a plane crash, probably, those skills are very different than what goes into making the iPhone. You know what I mean? So people that have those kind of skills might have to develop new ones in order to enter a different market of employment. And that's structural unemployment, right? It's when your skills kind of get out of date. And those things are normal for a growing economy. But if you push it past it, it can also be very unsustainable, right? So employees end up working beyond the amount of time that they should. So they're working overtime. People are employed that really don't want to be employed, right? Your physical capital, so the resources that we use in the economy, are stretched absolutely thin. So when we're overproducing like this for really long periods of time, then this shouldn't be able to last, right? We should experience some consequences of these things, right? We end up being less productive because our workers are so tired. We end up running out of resources that we need for some sort of sustainable normal rate of growth in the economy. It also just causes inflation. And you can probably think of some historical examples of this where the economy just grows too fast and then prices just blow up, right? And the reason why this happens is because wages end up rising, right? If you want to produce more and more and more, you need workers, and eventually you run out. So you have to start competing for these like limited supply of workers. You raise their wages, and so now you've increased your cost of production, and now everything is more expensive. So it's not necessarily true that everyone's just better off all the time if the economy just grows without bounds, right? Our goal kind of in this aggregate expenditures mindset is a normal rate of growth in the economy, right? Continuing to operate at this full employment level of GDP. So this is it. I'm going to get into, this is not the end of the lecture today. I'm going to get into, I'm supposed to start the aggregate demand and aggregate supply section. And then hopefully I'm going to be able to leave some time for questions. So if you want me to go back to any of that aggregate expenditure stuff that wasn't in the notes, we can look at that once I finish here, okay? These are in the notes. So you should be able to find these in that 20B section, and it should say aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And hopefully my slideshow will start. Cool. So these things are in the notes. All I'm going to talk about today is aggregate demand. You'll get some aggregate supply info and putting it all together info later with Dr. Ackerman, probably on Wednesday. So you'll notice when we talk about this that aggregate supply and aggregate demand on a graph look a lot like market supply and market demand. If you remember market demand and market supply, we've got this price and quantity axis, and then you get two kind of crisscross lines for demand and supply. And the aggregate demand and aggregate supply look very similar, but we think about them a bit differently. Now, if you remember, market demand is just the quantity of one good that consumers want to buy at various prices, right? If water bottles are $2, then maybe the economy, everyone in the economy wants 100 million of them. But if they're $5, maybe you don't want quite as much, right? Maybe you only want 80 million water bottles. That kind of thing is market demand. And those things are really informative if we want to know what happens in certain markets, right? What happens in the market for water bottles if plastic gets more expensive, or if we have some sort of natural disaster, then that's interesting and it's informative. But it's not very easy to get a picture of the entire economy by just looking at one or a handful of products. So instead, we want to measure that aggregates everything in the economy. By aggregate, we basically just mean we sum them all up. And the aggregate demand curve is overall consumption of everything in the entire economy, also known as real GDP, right? So the quantity axis when we study aggregate demand and aggregate supply is GDP. It's just everything that gets produced and also purchased in an economy. Okay. The price axis, so the y-axis, instead of just being like one price number, we're going to think of it like a price level, similar to learning about CPI, right? Because the reality is that everything in the economy, there's not a price for it, right? So like you can't just say how much is absolutely everything costing somebody. You can't have one unit of everything, right? So you think about prices as some sort of like aggregated average price level, something like CPI, right? Which is the consumer price index you guys learned about a few lectures ago. How that price level actually gets determined is kind of unimportant for the class, so don't worry too much about it. Just know that that's what you're putting on the graph, right? There's not like one price for one marginal unit of absolutely everything the economy produces. And sorry, I'm gonna click through. So it looks like this. Like I said, it's gonna look very similar to market demand. In fact, it looks exactly like market demand. We're just gonna label it AD instead of D. But we do think about it a little bit differently. So like I said, the x-axis is real GDP instead of normally just being quantity. And the y-axis is price level instead of just being price. So how do we think about the slope of this aggregate demand curve, right? What does it mean that this is downward sloping, and how do we interpret that slope? Well, in market demand, the slope is really nice and it's kind of like clear. It's basically just how much you change the quantity that you're purchasing with the changes in price. And the way that you do this is through substituting to other goods. So if I notice that the price of my favorite peanut butter at the store has gone up, I'm probably just going to buy another peanut butter, right? Or I'm going to buy something that's equivalent to peanut butter. Maybe I'm going to buy an almond butter or something like that, because I noticed that the price has gone up and, you know, I don't want as much of it anymore. But it's harder to do that when you're aggregating everything in the economy, right? What's your substitution for everything in the economy? And so there's not that kind of, oh, I just changed my mind, I buy something else. Interpretation when we talk about how prices impact aggregate demand. Because at the end of the day, I'm going to go back to the picture for just a second, but I'll come back to this if you don't worry if you didn't get the note. So what this relationship is describing is that as prices go down, real GDP goes up, right? And so that seems like an interesting relationship that we want to explore. Like I said, I'm coming back to this. I know some of these answers are in the workbook. So like I said, when we say aggregate demand slopes down, that means that lower prices increase GDP, and we're curious about why. So I'm going to go to another slide in just a second, but I'll let you guys write down whatever you need to from here. All right, hopefully you're able to get that. If not, like I said, the lecture slides are always posted. You can fill in the blanks later. There are three primary ways that we kind of think about how lower prices or higher prices, or you can always kind of flip this around to the opposite. Three ways that we think about how prices increase or decrease GDP. And the first one is kind of the basis for all of them, and it's just the wealth effect. This just means that liquid cash holdings are nominal, right? So basically, your buying power goes up if prices decrease and you're just holding that cash. If I have a $100 bill in my pocket and suddenly everything in the economy gets less expensive, now this $100 can buy me more things, right? It used to be able to buy me a set of things, and now it buys me a bigger set of things only because prices have decreased. right? So that's one way that we're going to be able to do this. And I'm going to talk about them individually. So don't worry, I'm going to continuously go back to that page that has 3 of them. I'm just going to talk about the wealth effect for right now. So like I said, if prices go up 10%, then you probably have real assets that increase in value according to prices. And so this kind of like maybe nullifies that change, right? So you have certain assets that kind of go up and down along with prices that get more or less expensive or more or less valuable. But your dollar holdings, your cash holdings, your really liquid holdings are nominal. That means they fluctuate, right? The value of those fluctuate along with prices. This is kind of what I'm describing about having the $100 in your pocket. It's just as easy to think about if you have $12,000 in your bank account, that has the same impact, right? And we also know that businesses and households always carry some amount of liquid cash, right? It could be more or less depending on the individual choices of those people, but people and firms have cash holdings. This means they're impacted by this wealth effect. It affects consumption, obviously, right? Just like I said, you can now buy more stuff with that $100 bill. So you probably are going to buy more stuff with that $100 bill. And it also ends up affecting investment. For a more specific way that this affects investment, I'm going to go ahead and go to the investments and interest rate slide. And don't worry, if you didn't catch one of these in the workbook, then I'll come back to it at the end. Okay, this is kind of like the last set of topics we have for today. So we'll have time to go back and discuss other things if you need blanks to fill in at the end. So the next way that prices are going to influence GDP is through investments and interest rates. Basically, this just means that when prices change, let's just say we'll continue with the example of prices decreasing. So if prices get lower and I have some amount of cash on me, I just got wealthier, right? Whatever I could buy before, it's now bigger only because prices changed. So I'm a wealthier person. I'm probably going to spend some of that extra money, and then I'm probably going to invest some of that extra money, right? And when I invest, this means that there's more loans to go around in those financial markets. Right now, businesses can borrow money from whatever bank that I have decided to use to invest my money. Then they can borrow from these institutions and they can increase their output through that, right? They can buy more capital, they can increase their operations, and now more stuff gets produced in the economy, right? So that's a method for real GDP to increase. Just some factory pictures. This is the same stuff, I'm just continuing to describe it. So the specific mechanism is basically like people get wealthier, they decide to save money, which means that they're really lending it, right? Those savings and lending kind of, when you save money, it gets lent out by whatever institution you saved it through. And this means that interest rates actually fall. So basically interest rates are just the price of borrowing money. And when there's more money to go around, the price of borrowing it is decreasing. This is just that normal law of demand. You get more of something, then that means the price of it falls. So there's more money to go around. It's cheaper for a business to go and get a loan for something. So they're probably going to do that. They're going to get loans, they're going to make investments, and they're going to make maybe some bigger purchases. They're going to build a new building, they're going to buy some more equipment, and now we get more stuff. So people are consuming more things because they're getting wealthier. Businesses are investing in things because the interest rate's fallen. And so these two mechanisms cause the prices to influence real GDP. Leave this up for an extra second, just in case there's a blank to fill in. Like I said, I don't have the workbook in front of me, so I don't know if that's true, but it may be. All right. The last thing is just an effect on exports. So if you remember, part of aggregate demand, which is the same as saying part of, this GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Net exports are a part of this aggregate demand or real GDP equation. And when we have prices change in our country, this makes our exporting goods more or less competitive on an international market. So if things that we produce become more or less expensive, that affects the decision of other countries to purchase them from us. So like, let's say we're really good at making, I don't know, crew neck sweatshirts. So we're producing a bunch of crew neck sweatshirts and other countries are buying them from us. Well, if our prices decrease, I'm going to go to this slide to kind of a more full description. If prices decrease, this means that our wages are allowed to change along with them. So now firms are spending less money on their resource cost because labor is cheaper. So they can sell their goods. Whoever's making crew neck sweatshirts can lower the price so that they can sell more, right? So now I can produce these goods much more cheaply. I lower the price. So even more countries want to buy our crew neck sweatshirts because we have made them more competitive, right? Maybe otherwise, there were other people producing crew neck sweatshirts that somebody was buying from, but now that we've lowered our price, we've outcompeted them and they're buying from us. We're producing more in our economy. Our net export value is going up. And that means that our aggregate demand and real GDP are increasing. Does that make sense? All right, this is the end of that slideshow. We finished about 5 minutes early. So if you guys have questions, I'll hang around for like a bit, even after the 12:20 class ends. To answer some questions, you can put them in the chat. You can unmute yourself. I can go back around.
Good job, Graham.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, good job, Graham.
Graham, you killed
Respect.
See you, Zach.
Appreciate
it.
Thank you.
Amazing, Graham.
Good job.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Phenomenal.
You guys are nice. I'm sorry there's no Monday.
Graham, you're the man.
Hi, Graham. Hey, Graham. Thanks, man.
Thank you, Graham.
Thanks, man.
I dig the specs.
Thanks, Graham.
Good job.
Good job.
Thanks,
Graham.
Graham. Thanks, Graham.
I like your cut, G.
Thanks, Graham. Could you go back to investments and interest rates that
Fuck with you.
Hey, thanks, Graham. Really appreciate it, bro.
Yeah, thank you guys.
All right.
I'm glad that this was able to work. I thought I heard somebody ask about investments and interest rates, so I came back to the slide. This is what you're talking about.
Thank you so much. That's all I needed. All right.
Yeah. I'll leave this up until somebody tells me to go somewhere else.
Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Graham. Really appreciate it, bro.
Yeah, absolutely. You guys have a good day.
Hey, thanks. Appreciate it, Graham. Thanks, bro.
Yeah, have a good one. So somebody has asked me about when GDP is too high. So can I switch to that slideshow? Whoever asked about investments and interest rates, we're able to get your information. I'm just going to believe that that's an affirmative answer. And so I'm going to switch over to the other slideshow. And I think this is what you're talking about, right? Why is too much GDP a bad thing? I'm going to bring it up. I'm going to pull the whole slide out and I'm going to I'll re-describe it for you, right? So when we're performing at a GDP above full employment, which is our normal rate, you can kind of think of it as that's the sweet spot for the economy to be in, right? We don't want anything more, we don't want anything less, we want to be there at full employment. It's the ideal. When it's too high, and it kind of, I guess it can be confusing, right? Because we're kind of in this mindset, especially as Americans, that like we need to grow, right? Bigger and bigger and bigger, but that's not necessarily true in this kind of aggregate expenditures framework. Excuse me, we don't want to just grow and grow and grow without bounds, because it means that people are staying in jobs that they aren't good matches for, because they're kind of like being worked, they're being overworked at their job. There's not so much opportunity to move along and find better work. You're just kind of, employees end up stuck in jobs that are bad matches for them. We're overusing all of our resources. So we're tapping our natural resources beyond a rate that they should be. We are making employees work more than they should be in this way that's sustainable, right? So they won't maintain their productivity. It also causes a lot of inflation, so people could actually become worse off, right? So like you get a lot of these consequences from just allowing your economy to grow beyond full employment rate in a way that becomes detrimental in the long run, right? So we probably spent, let me go back to this picture, the picture of the peaks and troughs. So this is normal for the economy, right? The goal isn't necessarily, or it might be the goal, but it's not a reasonable one, that we just have like this like flat, you know, straight line growth. We know we're going to have some ups and downs. What we don't want is really, really huge, right, downward troughs and gigantic recessions and depressions. And we also don't want just like enormously high peaks and large long run expansions. We want this to kind of be more stable over time. I hope that was a satisfactory explanation. I'm gonna kind of go on to the extra questions that are getting asked in the chat, but you could always schedule, if you want to talk more about this. I think this is really interesting. I think the business cycle is interesting. You can schedule office hours with me or Dr. Ackerman or something, whatever you want. Somebody asked me about the recessionary gap. So basically, it's just when we have this expenditure level that's below full employment, and we're going to describe it with just a single number. We want to know how big this is, right? It might make sense to you that a recessionary gap of $10 billion is much larger than a recessionary gap of $1 billion, right? It means that kind of our recession is worse. It's just a number we use to describe it. And here's the expression for it, right? It's just whatever our expenditures would be at full employment, and we subtract out whatever our expenditures are currently when we're operating below full employment. So in this example, right, we say at full employment, expenditures is 10 billion, but we're observing an expenditure of 8 billion. We've got a recessionary gap of that 2 billion difference. I don't think this stuff is on your note sheet, so you might just have to take handwritten notes on them. So someone asked, this is probably a good question, why would everyone being employed lead to working overtime? So the problem is that when we have this huge expansion, remember, it's not that every single like little bit of expansion is bad. We don't want like really large, long run expansion times, because what this means is we're not just tapping people, we're not just like bringing in everyone to work that wants to work. That's good, right? So if we say, everyone that wants a job kind of has one and we're doing fine, that's nice. That's kind of what we mean by this full employment. But what if we push it past? Now, what if I want more work than that? But there's not any more workers to go around, right? Everyone that wants a job already has a job. And so when you want even more from your labor force, now you have to work more, right? You can't just hire more people. There aren't more people to hire. Now those people that were already working for you, they've got to work more hours. I hope that makes sense. Someone asked, is the recessionary gap and the inflationary gap the same? So the expression looks the same, and the idea is kind of similar. It's just the difference between whatever you're observing is happening in the economy and full employment GDP. But the inflationary gap is going to be whatever you're at above full employment minus full employment. And recessionary gap, you kind of like switch what position this full employment GDP is in. Recessionary gap, you do full employment GDP minus whatever you're at currently, that's below full employment. So these will both be positive numbers, right? If this was a recession and I did this inflationary gap calculation, I get a negative number. We get those from the equations. Are you talking about how we get this number? Like, how did I get this 3 billion? Yeah, so I know that this is full employment, 10 billion, and I know we're currently at 13 billion. So the expenditures above full employment is 13, and full employment is 10. So 13 minus 10, that's how I got that 3.